Okay. Hello there. We're going to take a few minutes here to introduce the first movie that we're going to watch, Casablanca, and also go over some aspects of characterization and character types. So, if you had dramatic lit last semester, a lot of this is actually going to be it's going to be review. Good news there. Yeah, let's get into this. So the first thing I want to go over when it comes to characterization is a character arc, which is the process of how a character changes over the course of a story. So generally, you have characters who will start off a story one way, and over the course of the story, they'll change and they'll change into something else. Prime example over here on the right is Walter White. If you've seen Breaking Bad, I highly recommend it. It's a great show. But Walter White is a great example of a character who has a pretty major and substantial character arc over the course of the series. Walt undergoes a very major transformation throughout that series, from kind of the mild-mannered, kind of dweeby chemistry teacher to the hard-boiled drug kingpin who wants to control the meth trade in Albuquerque. So pretty substantial, pretty radical character arc. However, character arcs can also be smaller and focused on, smaller transformations. It kind of depends on the type of story and the type of character it is. What's important to understand is that not all characters will have a character arc, and not all characters need character arcs either. You can have effective stories where not all of your characters have character arcs. Actually, I'd argue that all effective stories, I'd argue it's impossible in a reasonably length story, particularly in film. I'd argue it's impossible to give every character a character arc, simply because we don't have time to do that. And if you think about it, that actually does kind of make it a bit more realistic, where kind of like life, you don't know everything about every person you encounter or you interact with. And because of that, you're not going to be around them enough to understand who they are, who they were, how they might be changing. Similar thing with characters in fiction. If the character is not a major enough character that we get to spend a significant amount of time with, odds are they're not going to have a character arc, if for no other reason than because we don't have time or we don't get to know them well enough to develop them enough to have a character arc. So this kind of illustrates why it's called a character arc, because it's like an arc, like the shape. So yeah, it's an arc. Woo. And as we'll see later on in this course, in a lot of stories, the plot and stories are structured around the character arc and vice versa, where major story elements correspond to major moments in that character arc. Okay, so now that we've addressed what a character arc is, I want to go over how character arcs impact the different types of characters. And to this end, we're going to go look at 4 different types of characters based around 2 different criteria. So the 2 criteria we're looking at are whether a character changes or doesn't change, and the other one is this a developed or undeveloped character? So to give examples of each one of these characters, we have Star Wars characters, because there are a bunch of different characters in Star Wars, and because of that, Star Wars provides characters to illustrate all of these different types. So the first one to look at is a static character. A static character is a character that doesn't change. So they're pretty similar to who they were at the beginning of the story to who they were at the end of the story. And that kind of is paired with, it is the inverse of dynamic characters, where a dynamic character is a character that does change over the course of the story. So another way to think about it is that a dynamic character, since they change, has a character arc. A static character does not have a character arc because they don't change. So that's another way to kind of think about how this relates to character arcs. Okay? The other type of thing to look at, we have flat characters and round characters. So flat characters refer to undeveloped characters. Characters that are not what we would call three-dimensional or fully fleshed out. We have a general impression of them, but we don't really get a full, complete understanding of who this person is. We get just a general overview. And again, stories, even good stories, are going to have flat characters. Because again, to have a reasonably length and well-paced and structured story, there's not enough time, more than likely, to develop every single character in there. It's okay and sometimes necessary to have flat characters who are going to serve specific functions, but who, for reasons that might be based around story structure or perspective, we just don't get to know well enough or spend enough time with to understand who they were. I know I've got Star Wars characters here, and I'll explain and kind of illustrate these characters in a minute, but the Harry Potter series is a great example of a pretty effective story that has a lot of flat characters. And again, because of the way that story is told and structured, it makes sense. The story is told predominantly from Harry's perspective. So the characters that Harry knows or that Harry gets to spend a lot of time with, like his friends, are pretty well developed. But other characters who even might be significant presences in the story, they're not fully developed because Harry doesn't get to see the more fully fleshed out versions of those characters. Prime examples of those characters would be like the teachers at Hogwarts. They're in like all the books, they're in all the movies, they're around all the time, and yet they're pretty undeveloped. A lot of the teachers are pretty undeveloped because Harry, our protagonist and the person that the story is told from, Harry doesn't really get to see their fully fleshed outside. Okay? And last type of character is a round character, and round characters are developed characters. So, if we're going to look at these four characters here, I'm going to give you both the whether like the static or dynamic and the flat or round, and explain why for each one. So the first example, Han Solo. Han Solo is a static round character. He's round because he's a pretty well-developed character. We get to know Han Solo pretty well over the course of the movies, particularly, again, the original trilogy. But we get to know Han Solo pretty well over those movies. But he's static because he really doesn't change all that much. He has a pretty significant change in New Hope, where when he comes back to help the rebels in the end of the movie, and kind of signifies that he's becoming less selfish. But that's kind of it. After that, his character arc is done. He's there. He's a fun presence in the rest of the movies, but he doesn't change. He stays the same. Okay, and kind of another good example of this would be Emperor Palpatine, who is also, I'd argue, a static and a round character. Palpatine, again, is round. We understand a lot of... He's pretty well developed. We understand who he is and what makes him tick. But he's static because, like Han Solo, and actually even to a greater degree of Han Solo, Palpatine does not change at all, no matter what movie he's in. Regardless of which movie he's in, Palpatine is the same character. Even if he, like, it's pre-transformation, he's still the evil Dark Lord who wants to take over the universe and is purely selfish and only cares about himself. He's like that over the course of the entire series, does not change. Okay. Third one, Boba Fett. Boba Fett is a static character. He doesn't really change. But he's also a flat character. He's pretty undeveloped, or rather, pre-Mandalorian Boba Fett. I know Boba Fett Mandalorian is kind of changing with that. But original trilogy Boba Fett, he's static. He does not change. He stays pretty, he stays the same. But he's also flat. He's undeveloped. We don't really get to know that much about him. The guy hardly has any lines. All we really know is that he's a bounty hunter who's generally pretty good at his job. And that's kind of all we get in terms of character development for Boba Fett. Okay. Last example I want to look at is Luke Skywalker. So Luke is a dynamic character. He has a character arc. He changes drastically over the course of the original trilogy. And Luke is also a round character. He's a really developed, fully fleshed out character, which makes a lot of sense because he's our protagonist. It makes sense that since he's the protagonist and the one that we spend the most time with in the original trilogy, that he's the one that he definitely gets a lot of development and that he has a pretty substantial character arc. Okay. Now, on to the Casablanca intro and the second part of this video. So, Casablanca is a really interesting movie. It's very much a product of its time. And because of that, there's a lot of social and cultural and political context surrounding this movie that modern audiences won't necessarily get. And that's just because, again, culture and politics and society, it's just radically different now than it was in the 1940s when this movie was made. And because of that, there are certain things that the movie does not necessarily explain because at the time you didn't need to explain it, everybody knew it. So, probably the most important thing to understand with Casablanca and the most important influence on it was World War II. This movie was released in the early 1940s during World War II. This was made and released during World War II, and notably in the middle of World War II. So around the time the U.S. had entered the war, but before the tide had turned definitively against the Axis. So the outcome of the war was still very much up in the air when this movie was released. So Casablanca is set in the year 1941 in the real city of Casablanca in Morocco, which at that time was a French colony. So just some backstory, 1941, so Pearl Harbor happens in December of 1941. So this movie is set after the Nazis, after Germany has conquered Europe, but before their invasion of the Soviet Union starts to go bad, and before the U.S. has gone into the war. Again, the movie is set before Pearl Harbor, so the U.S. is not in the war yet. At this point in time, it's basically Germany fighting the UK and the Soviets, and Germany's winning. Also, that kind of plays into the political nature of Casablanca and Morocco. So Morocco was a French colony, but those of you that have already had U.S. history and gone over World War II, France was conquered by Germany in 1940, and after France was conquered, Germany realized that they did not have the manpower to fully occupy and subjugate France. And furthermore, that would just be a gigantic waste of resources for them to even do. So what they wound up doing was they divided France into two sections. A northern section that was directly occupied and governed by Germany and occupied by the Nazi army, and a southern portion governed from the city of Vichy that was technically independent, but only as long as they collaborated with Nazi Germany and did what they wanted. So the Vichy government, even though it was nominally free, in reality, it was a puppet government for Germany. If Vichy disobeyed German dictates or German wishes, they could just be occupied and taken over. So Morocco then, as a French colony, was not governed or occupied directly by the Germans, but it was governed by the Vichy government, or rather the collaborationist pro-Nazi government. However, and this is also, again, really interesting about the setting of this movie, since Morocco and Casablanca they're not in Europe, the Vichy government does not really have a lot of power in Casablanca. Casablanca in this movie, it's depicted as barely having a semblance of law and order, like a functioning society, just because the major government has bigger issues to worry about, notably World War II, and the local government is hopelessly corrupt. Okay, so other important point, within Casablanca itself, there are two separate factions of the French that exist there. You have the Vichy faction, or the collaborationist faction, and then you have a rebel faction known as the Free French. So the Free French opposed the Vichy government because they opposed Nazism and Germany, and to that extent they opposed the Vichy government because they were willingly collaborating with Germany. That is a significant point in this movie that is not really explained because, again, anyone living during this time period would know the difference between like Vichy and Free France and what was going on. Last important point about Casablanca, I have a map on the next slide that I will use to kind of illustrate all this stuff as well. So the last important point about Casablanca, it was the final significant port en route to Lisbon. So because what happens in any major war, World War II created a lot of refugees in Europe. A lot of people wanted to get out of Europe just to get away from the war. And most of them mentioned that their end target, they wanted to get to the United States. Because of Nazi occupation, they could not go directly from Europe to the United States. They had to get out of Nazi-occupied or pro-German Europe. And really the only way to do that was to get to Portugal. Portugal was neutral during the war. So because Portugal was neutral, they could get there from Germany and then take a ship from Lisbon to get to the U.S. Casablanca was the last major stop on this refugee trail to get out of what was effectively Nazi Europe and basically get into Lisbon to eventually get to the U.S. However, it was really difficult to get out of Casablanca. The immigration restrictions put in place by the Germans and the French, or the French at the behest of the Germans, served to effectively trap most of the refugees in Casablanca. They mention in the movie that it was really, really difficult to get an exit visa that would allow you to leave Casablanca and go to Portugal. It generally required political connections and having enough money or resources to be able to bribe people or you'd have to go through the black market to get transport out. Or, and this is kind of where the plot of the movie kicks in, you could get what was effectively the golden ticket, get out of jail free card, which was a letter of transit, which basically allowed the bearer to go wherever they wanted, no questions asked. So I know there's a lot to go over there. Put into context with the movie, they should make more sense. Hopefully this map will make a bit more sense as well. So again, 1941, this is the map of Europe. All of the purple is area that is either directly occupied by Nazi Germany or collaborating with Nazi Germany. So you can see they've penetrated deep into the Soviet Union. This is, again, before they lose the Battle of Stalingrad and the Soviets start pushing them back. This is before the U.S. has entered the war. So as you can see, Germany is doing really, really well at this point. Casablanca is down here. Portugal is over here. So again, you see how Casablanca is effectively the last major stop to get from Nazi Germany to Portugal. And then here you see the dividing line between occupied France and Vichy France. So hopefully that kind of clears things up. Okay, just some interesting stuff about the movie. So Casablanca was released in 1942, directed by Michael Curtiz. Stars a number of major actors from the period, notably Humphrey Bogart, Ingrid Bergman, Paul Henreid, Claude Rains. What's also really interesting about a lot of the production of this movie is that this is an American movie, but a lot of the actors and the crew were actually European. And that's because, as I mentioned, there were a lot of refugees that fled Europe during World War II. Prior to the outbreak of war, when the Nazi Party was implementing a lot of their more restrictive policies, a lot of people in Europe did not like the direction that Germany was going, and they left. They went to the U.S. So a lot of the actors and production crew of this movie were actually European, what were effectively refugees or immigrants fleeing from the Nazis. Again, notably, there were a number of French actors in this movie. There's a scene in the movie where the French national anthem is played and kind of sung as like a protest against the Nazis. And there are a number of shots where you see French actors like having really like intense emotional reactions to that song, because at the time of the film, at the time of the filming of that and the release of it, their home country was occupied by Nazis. So that's something that's really interesting I found about this movie. The production, how again there were a lot of European actors and production crew involved in it, even though it was an American film. Did pretty well. Again, won the Academy Awards for Best Picture, Best Director, and Best Adapted Screenplay. Casablanca was actually originally written as a play called Everybody Comes to Rick's, but the play was never produced. There were the producers of the movie. They read it and they loved it and wanted to turn it into a movie. So they immediately bought the film rights to it before it was even produced. So this started off as a play that was never put on because they were like, "This is so good, we want to make a movie out of it right now." Which part of me is a bit disappointed because this would be a really great play. So anyway, the four major stars of the movie. So over here you've got Humphrey Bogart, who's playing the main character Rick. You have Claude Rains, Paul Henreid, Ingrid Bergman. Of the four, Bogart's the only American. Claude Rains is British. Paul Henreid is, I believe, Austrian, and Ingrid Bergman was Norwegian or Swedish. He was Scandinavian or something. So, to try and explain what this movie's about. So, our main character is Rick Blaine, played by Humphrey Bogart. Rick is an American expatriate who owns Rick's Cafe Americain. For reasons that are never explained, Rick had to leave the U.S., and he wound up settling in Casablanca, where he owns what is effectively a nightclub. And Rick's bar is kind of a focal point for the town of Casablanca. This is where the title of the play comes from, but everybody goes to Rick's. Everybody goes there. The Free French people, the Vichy people, Nazi officials, black market people, everybody goes there. So there's a lot of stuff that goes on in his bar, and yet, notably, Rick is pretty neutral. Rick does not directly involve himself in any of that business and doesn't really care about any of that. He just wants to run his bar and not be bothered, and to that extent doesn't really bother with anybody else. Yeah. This situation is kind of upended, at least for Rick, when Ilsa Lund, played by Ingrid Bergman, comes back into his life. She is his ex-girlfriend, and over the course of the movie, you learn a lot about what their relationship was like and what the ultimate circumstances were that involved them breaking up. But they have a really interesting dynamic, and you can kind of tell that there's pretty much right from when they meet, there's a lot of unresolved stuff with their relationship. They have not gotten closure, which is also kind of made worse by Victor Laszlo, played by Paul Henreid, who is Ilsa's husband and a major Czech freedom fighter. They mentioned that earlier in the war, Laszlo was arrested and put into a concentration camp, but he actually managed to escape and make his way to Casablanca to try and get to America, where he can try and continue the resistance against Nazism from there. In this situation, we also have Louis Renault, who is the prefect of police in Casablanca. So Louis is effectively the official head of the government of Casablanca. He's a Vichy French official who is totally and shamelessly corrupt. Louis breaks a lot of his own laws a lot and allows people to break the law pretty regularly, as long as they're able to bribe him. In a number of instances, the fact that Louis is corrupt actually works to the advantage of the refugees, because they're able to bribe him to get their exit visas and get out. But kind of like Rick, Louis is also pretty neutral. Louis does not really care about like the war or who's in charge. Louis is really just out looking for himself, and he mentions he's working with the Vichy government because the Vichy government is currently the one in charge, and that's why he's doing it. Okay, now on to lesser characters and into the antagonist. The antagonist is Heinrich Strasser, who is a German major who was sent to Casablanca to capture Laszlo and basically stop him from doing his resistance stuff and bring him back to Germany. You also have Signor Ferrari, who is the head of the black market, and the guy that sets the plot in motion. You have Signor Ugarte. Ugarte is a thief who steals 2 letters of transit from murdered German couriers. This is all fundamentally what sets the plot in motion. The beginning of the movie, it starts with news of 2 German couriers being murdered out in the desert and their letters of transit being stolen from them. As I mentioned before, letters of transit were basically like a get-out-of-jail-free card. Whereas there were a lot of ifs and stipulations that could be added to exit visas. letters of transit were good for anybody. So they could not be questioned, they couldn't be rescinded. So if you had a letter of transit, you were good to go to get out of Casablanca. So they are incredibly valuable. So once news gets out that there are 2 letters of transit that are just kind of floating around, a lot of people are really interested to get them back and find out what happened to them. You have Ferrari, who wants them so he can sell them on the black market because he'll make a lot of money. You've got Strasser and Louis, who want to get them back to basically prevent high-profile targets from getting out of Casablanca. And you also got people like Ilsa and Victor who want them because since Victor is such a high-profile target in opposition of the Nazis, a letter of transit is really the only way this dude is getting out of Casablanca. So you've got a lot of different people who are really interested in these things. And then at the end, you've got Rick, who does not care, which is kind of awesome. Okay, last thing I want to end on, or kind of redundant, the thing I want to end on, looking at the major themes of this movie. So you have the theme of the conflict between cynicism and idealism. Effectively, the conflict between hopelessness and hopefulness, or pessimism and optimism. So you have more cynical characters like Rick and Louis who kind of view the world as, yeah, this situation sucks, but it is what it is, and I kind of have to make the best of it. And to that end, they generally kind of look out for themselves and don't really try to bother with making the world a better place or fixing the problems that they see, because they don't think there's really any hope of making the world better or fixing the problems. Contrast that with more idealistic people like Victor, who, again, is a freedom fighter and a member of the resistance against the Nazi government, who believes that it's important to, yes, the world at this moment might be bad, but it's important to fight to make it right, no matter the cost, even if that means sacrificing stuff for yourself. It's important to go through that sacrifice and try and have the hope that things can get better. The theme of corruption and the fact that everybody in their own way is kind of corrupt is also prevalent throughout this movie in a lot of different ways. You have characters like Louis, who, again, he's supposed to be like the authority figure and represent law and order, and yet he's totally corrupt and doesn't really care about law and order, and is willing to overlook stuff as long as he's paid for it or compensated for it. You also have honest characters like Victor and Ilsa and a lot of the refugees who, because of circumstance, are forced to turn to some shadier sources or engage in shadier, arguably immoral activities to try and get what they want. And lastly, the movie, this kind of ties into the Rick and Ilsa arc and subplot. The movie argues that there's a relationship between love and selflessness, and that almost it's like that true love is selflessness, and that a person is willing, like basically true love means that you're willing to put that other person's happiness and well-being ahead of your own. And I'm not really going to go into a lot more detail with that because, again, that kind of gets into spoiler territory. I like this movie a lot. I know that, one, this is not the ideal format to watch it in, because, you know, gotta love living during the time of COVID. And I also know that on the surface, when you hear, like, this is a movie that's, like, 80 years old and, you know, black and white and stuff, you know, it doesn't sound that interesting. But I promise you, this movie really holds up. It's a phenomenal movie. A lot of film experts consider it one of the best movies of all time. It holds up really well. Every year, every semester when I teach this class, that's always the reaction I get from people when they see this movie. That it's a lot better than they thought it was going to be. It's a wonderful movie. And again, while I'm sad that this is the way we have to watch it, I'm still glad that we're at least going to get to do this. So enjoy the rest of your day, and we'll get rolling on this tomorrow.